We're excited to have experts engaged in some very exciting on-the-ground work. Joining us tonight for our discussion on surviving the Uber economy. First, we have Caitlin Pearce of the Freelancers Union. Caitlin is Director of Member Engagement at Freelancers Union, the nation's largest group representing the growing independent workforce, overseeing advocacy, education, and community growth for the 300,000 member union. Caitlin is a guiding force in the union's drive to help the new workforce build a more sustainable, mutualistic society. She is currently leading Freelancers Isn't Free, a national campaign to put an end to non-payment and late payment for independent workers. She lives in Brooklyn and moonlights as a freelance musician. Next, we have Cole Stangler of the magazine In These Times. Cole writes about labor and the environment at In These Times. His reporting has also appeared in The Nation, Vice, The New Republic, The American Prospect, and International Business Times. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by TCF Senior Fellow Shayna Strom. Shayna is a Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation, where she works on issues related to the future of work, future of organizing, poverty, and inequality. She's also a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, teaching classes on making social change. She has worked with several prominent foundations and spent a number of years in the government. Previously, she did organizing work in Ohio, New York, New Jersey. In her spare time, she was a founding senior editor and writer for Next City, a nonprofit journalistic outlet about cities. Thank you all for agreeing to help shed some light on this important issue that I'm sure many of us have plenty of questions about. With that, I'll go ahead and hand the conversation to you, Shayna. Thank you.
Mic on? Can people tell me? Okay, great. And thank you to Caitlin and Cole for being here. We're really looking forward to this conversation today. So maybe just to get us started, let's just talk a little bit about what why we're here and what this conversation is about. So to start, what is the gig economy? Like, to what extent is it new, and why are we suddenly talking about it so much when we haven't met before?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because this term, the gig economy, gets thrown around a lot, and it's unclear a lot of times what it actually refers to. So recently, people use the word gig economy to refer to, at the smallest level, it can refer to these kind of largely online-based or app-based platforms that provide work on demand. And so the most obvious example is something like Uber, this company that's expanded tremendously in the last few years, a company like Lyft, places like Grubhub, and these other kind of just these online or app-based things. And it's actually a pretty small sliver of the workforce, about 600,000 workers, according to Alan Krieger and Seth Harris, who are economists who looked at this, 400,000 of whom drive for Uber. But we also can use the word gig economy to refer to the kind of section of the workforce that is not protected by kind of traditional employment protections and that are not employees in the traditional sense. So they're freelancers. Maybe they don't sign even a contract. They're just doing the work on the side and hope to get paid. And we've seen that share of the workforce kind of growing modestly. I wouldn't say it's huge, but it's growing modestly. But I think the reason why we're talking about independent contractors so much and talking about freelancers, and maybe you disagree with this, but I think a lot of it is really being spurred by these apps. It's that we've had workers that are freelancers and contractors, and in some cases being misclassified as such in the past. But we're talking about it now because I work in journalism, and you hear your editors that don't really think about labor issues that often, that might take Uber to work someday, or their friends are using Lyft. And so I think the media has helped kind of propel this discussion and kind of discovering this issue of contract work and freelancers in large part because of these apps. And so maybe that's not the most satisfying answer, but I think in a lot of ways the media has kind of pushed this issue to the forefront. And for people who care about labor rights, I think it offers an opportunity to talk about not just the plight that's facing these people that work for apps, that work for Uber or Lyft, but people who are misclassified writ large, or who are being illegally classified as contractors.
So you mentioned a really important word, which is independent contractor. Can we just say what is an independent contractor for everyone here in the audience? Caitlin, do you want to
Yeah, so if you're doing a job and what we typically ask people is, are you working full-time? Do you have an employer? And do you have a W-2 and a full suite of benefits? If not, you're probably some type of independent worker or freelancer, which is what we classify that work as. And so employment is really, and independent contracting is really a legal classification that governs what type of access or what type of the work relationship looks like, with dictates, whether you get access to different type of benefits, whether you're directly managed, or whether you're a contractor, which is a slightly more removed way of working with a company, which often lacks benefits and support. So one of the big problems we see among freelance workers is that they often, when they're working with clients, they have a lot of different work opportunities, but they have to manage all of that work on their own independently. And they also have to find ways to provide benefits for themselves, like getting access to health insurance or figuring out how to do their taxes, or they also lack the employment protections that you get when you're an employee. So, as an employee, you have basic protections, access to a safe work environment, and workers' compensation if you get hurt at the office, or protection against discrimination, and those types of things. The real distinction when you're a freelancer is that you don't have access to those types of labor protections.
So Cole mentioned that a lot of the reason we're talking about this now is in part because of these kinds of apps like Uber, and that is, I think, what a lot of people think about when they think of gig economy workers. But I know, Caitlin, that Freelancers Union has a much more diverse membership. Can we talk both about Freelancers Union's membership and then who's in the gig economy writ large? Who are really these workers? Are they all the same people who are Uber drivers?
Sure. So at Freelancers Union, and we've been around since 1995, and we represent 300,000 independent workers, is what we sort of call the blanket category of different types of freelance workers. And those are people that are working across all industries and professions, and often people who are working in multiple industries and professions at one time. So the classic example is a graphic designer or a writer who works with a variety of different clients, but it might also be someone who is a small business owner, or someone who is a yoga teacher that's singing opera on the side, that's also driving Uber on the weekends to make extra money. It's people that are putting together different types of income streams. We do an annual report called Freelancing in America, where we've sized this workforce as at 54 million Americans, which is just over 30% of the workforce. And what that was is a really comprehensive look at anyone who's doing a variety of different type of work arrangements. So that could be traditional independent contractors, that could be people who are solo business owners, people who have a temp job but are doing additional freelance work on the side, people who are working in the sharing and on-demand economy, but combining it with other income streams. And then most interestingly, we found that about 25% of this workforce are moonlighters. So people that have a full-time W-2 job but are doing additional freelance work on the side to make extra money, or often to just do work that's interesting to them, pursue their own passions. And so when we're talking about this workforce, it's really a huge, diverse group of people that are engaging in it for different reasons and with different challenges and concerns, who have a very different experience, not just based on industry, but like how their work is actually being set up. I think that was good.
Yeah, I mean, so actually, I saw the Freelancers Union uses this number 54 million. It seems a little high, talking to other kind of experts in the field and looking at the BLS numbers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which we can also maybe get to the problems with their own way of calculating how many freelancers there are in the economy. But I mean, according to the BLS, there's just around 10 million workers who are qualified as self-employed, which doesn't capture everyone who could potentially be a freelancer. I mean, if you have a W-2, you're an employee, you're working a job 30 hours a week, and you do kind of freelance work on the side, I think that your study would include that 10 hours that you do on the side as being you're a freelancer, whereas maybe that person wouldn't consider consider themselves to be a freelancer. So just there are wide kind of estimates on how many people are actually contractors or freelancers. Just wanted to make that point first. But I think at any rate, there's evidence that this is a share of the workforce that's that's growing, and we can debate how much it really is growing. But it's certainly getting a lot of attention. It's a topic that's worth focusing on, because as you mentioned, these are workers that if you're a contractor, you're not protected by minimum wage laws. You don't have to be paid a minimum wage. You're not protected by, you don't get overtime. You don't get workers' compensation, as you were pointing out. These are all things that are associated with employment in the United States, and you have this share of the workforce that basically is being denied the protections that you assume you have at work. And people might be doing this kind of work and don't realize that, their employer can pay them $6 an hour and get away with it. And that's the kind of situation we're seeing at Uber. This is a company that if you drive for Uber 40 hours a week, the company's not required to reimburse you. You're paying that expenses every time you're going to the car wash to clean the car, to put like candy in your car, water bottles in your car, whatever it is. You're paying for that out of pocket. And if you don't make more than minimum wage, then too bad. And Uber's taking that big share of the profit as well. So, these are workers that are lacking basic protections, and I think it's really important, to focus on them.
So, you both raised a bunch of really interesting things that I want to ask you about, but I want to just pull out two really important points that I think you guys made. One is that this is a very diverse workforce in terms of who we're actually talking about here. It's everybody from domestic workers to Uber drivers to people who are working a full-time job and doing something like this on the side, just either to make ends meet or because they're enjoying the work. And so we're really, when we're talking about sort of what we can do to help them, we really are talking about a wide range of things, or needing to encompass a wide range of people. But the other thing that I think is really important is that of all those people, the traditional, what people traditionally think of as the gig economy, namely Uber drivers, is really a very small part of that. So in fact, there was a study that showed that the sort of people who work for apps are 0.5% of the 2015 workforce. So a really, really small portion of the group that both Caitlin and Cole are talking about. So Cole, you were talking about Uber. So maybe, and we've called this a survival guide to the Uber economy. So let's talk for a second about some of the controversy that's been going on over Uber. A lot of folks in this audience have probably heard about all the various lawsuits where drivers are suing Uber over their classification as independent contractors. Why does that matter?
Yeah, it matters because these are people that are putting in, there are some people who are putting in just a few hours a week. There are others who are putting in 30, 40 hours a week. These are people that go out and they see ads for Uber or they see ads for Lyft, for instance, that say, be your own boss, this kind of romantic idea of being a freelancer and being able to be in charge. So they see that and they go out and buy a car. And I've talked to drivers like this who've gone out and footed the bill for buying a vehicle thinking they're going to get by driving Uber. And you have, according to that Kruger and Harris paper I was talking about, 400,000 people in the United States that are driving Uber in some capacity. These are people that, like I was saying, don't have access to what we consider to be like the basic kind of labor protections that are part of the safety net of being an employee. And Uber is continuing to pocket money on these rides, and so it's Uber takes around 20-25%. It depends on the city, and you can be driving 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, and not be getting overtime. And I think that matters. It matters in the context of, when we look at labor markets in cities, is it good to be having a lot of workers who are making around minimum wage, below minimum wage? There was actually a report that came out. BuzzFeed was able to get their hands on documents from Uber that kind of estimating the range of how much these drivers are making per hour. It ranges between $8 to around 15, I think, kind of around that general range. This is not a lot of money, and it's bad in the labor market. It's bad to be living somewhere where people are making around minimum wage or even less than minimum wage. So to get back to the question about the lawsuits, the lawsuits, there's been a number of them. There's the really big one where they're right now in the process of coming to a settlement, potentially, drivers in California that say they're owed millions of dollars in just unpaid wages, essentially wage theft, that Uber is pocketing this money that they're owed. And so the reason that case matters and why other misclassification cases matter, I think so much with Uber being just like this tremendously valuable company. If Uber, as a part of the settlement, were forced to reclassify their drivers as employees and not independent contractors, then it could have effects on the rest of these so-called gig economy companies. If Uber is going to reclassify tens of thousands of drivers, I think Lyft would probably do it as well. And I've talked to people, other people who are in management from these apps, talking about, are you guys paying attention to the Uber lawsuit? And everyone's paying attention to it because they know that just how high profile this company is. And if Uber can't get away with it, then maybe you're probably not going to get away with it either.
So this raises a question which I suspect there may be some disagreement up here about, which is, the rise of the gig economy in general. Is this a good or a bad development, or neither or both, and why? Maybe Caitlin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's, just not to go back to Uber too much because I want to answer your question, but that's interesting is that, yes, these companies and these platforms like Uber, Lyft, Handy, these platforms that are employing thousands and hundreds of thousands of freelancers at a time are relatively new development, and they're still a small segment of the overall independent workforce. But one thing that's really interesting about them is it now gives kind of a face to who the independent workforce is working with and how to organize them. So from an organizer standpoint, we say, oh, we could actually start looking at these big employers that are aggregating big groups of independent workers and think about how to raise the standards by starting with these hubs, right? And so that's really interesting. I think when it comes to misclassification, I think it's a really big problem in many industries, and it always has been a big problem. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people are looking at this Uber lawsuit as sort of setting a standard, but from our point of view, as an organization at Freelancers Union, we really believe two things. One is that we believe that the independent workforce is growing, and whether or not that's a good or bad thing, I think is not beside the point, but like our ethos as an organization is we really need to find a way to bring help to these workers now. Because one thing that happens when you focus solely on this classification issue is you're really not addressing the needs of a growing group of workers that's existing right now. So we have this large diverse group of independent workers. How can we think about organizing them as workers, employees, not a worker is a worker is a worker? What benefits and standards can we be setting across the board that would also ideally help hinder misclassification? Because if we were improving the conditions of this workforce that didn't have benefits, that didn't have standards around wages, perhaps we would be giving employers less incentive to be misclassifying. So, I mean, to answer your question directly about is it a good thing or not, I mean, I think our members would answer it in a complicated way, which is that some of them love being freelancers. They chose it. They do love being their own boss, and they are getting to be their own boss, and they are using it as a vehicle to pursue work that they really care about with clients that they want to work with, and they're the lucky ones. And there's other people that either have gotten laid off and rehired as a freelancer or have gotten somehow pigeonholed into this industry and they don't like it. But what we tend to find with working with freelancers over the last 20 years is that, like it or not, they realize and recognize that freelancing is here to stay, and they're trying to figure out how to band together with freelancers and organize and improve the standards of that work. I do think that in general, it's not a problem with the freelancing, it's a problem with the lack of benefits that come with the freelancing. And that's what we really focus on through providing workers advocacy benefits and services that are oriented around independent work.
Yeah, I mean, I really disagree, and it's fine. We just have a big disagreement on this question. But I mean, I don't think we should be celebrating the fact that we have a rising share of the workforce that doesn't have access to basic minimum wage overtime protections, no workers' comp, no unemployment insurance. This is a problem. So we need to be concerned that you have this share of the workforce that's growing. And I mean, maybe there are some Uber drivers who can get by and maybe pat themselves on the back and say that they're their own boss. I don't think that's the case for most Uber drivers. So I don't think we should be careful about romanticizing this idea, because that's actually the company's argument. I mean, this is the argument that the bosses are putting forward. Lyft's ads, say, be your own boss. The kind of argument that Uber is making is the same argument that employers have been making for decades. I mean, and we should be really clear. Like, if you, maybe we can get to this portion later, but if you have an opportunity to be an employee or a freelancer, you want to be an employee. I mean, most of the cases. I think like, I don't want to say across the board. There are some people who can do well freelancing, but for average people, working class people, you don't want to be a freelancer. Maybe we have this kind of romantic idea that companies put out there because it serves their own interests, but it's not something that's financially viable. And I think we should also say, yeah, I mean, the Freelancers Union recently, signed an agreement with Uber as well to be a strategic advisor to Uber. So I think maybe that's part of the disagreement here as well. Is that I think we absolutely should be focusing on misclassification. I mean, this is companies that are breaking the law. And the thing that's so interesting about Uber, this company that's been so successful, raising an enormous amount of money from investors, is the company's success built on this innovative technology, this app that it's using that somehow no one else has developed before? Is it that? Or is it the fact that you have basically a legal misclassification across the board? So I think, there are true freelancers, and I'm not saying every Uber driver has to be an employee or is an employee. I have no doubt that there are Uber drivers that are doing it on the side. But I mean, I think we need to be challenging people who are concerned about labor rights, about workers' rights, about workers. We need to be challenging these arguments and not buying into and not promoting the company's line, which is freelance and be your own boss and have a great time, because it's really hard. And I've talked to Uber drivers, and it's not something that people love to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say two things to that. And just to be clear, I think even the most zealous, hardcore freelancer would not celebrate their lack of benefits and protections. And that's where we really, I think it's not fair to characterize our work that way, because what's really core to what we do is we have worked with our members to try to envision a way to get our members better access to benefits, and working with our members around campaigns that help protect their rights as freelancers. And so certainly not trying to be overly rosy about the freelance workforce, but I think you can still have pride in the work that you do and want to improve the conditions of the way you work.
Of course, no doubt. Yeah.
I also think, to be blunt, when it comes to misclassification, I think that the independent work, I think, misclassification, again, it's not my job to decide if these drivers, we'll see what the court says, yeah. But it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to reclassify all independent workers as employees, nor do they all truly fit into that category. Yeah, and so
I don't disagree
our
with that,
ethos is really, let's find a way to help these workers, many of whom are struggling without access to affordable health care, without access to protections, if struggling against discrimination, having a hard time finding work, dealing with clients who don't pay. That's a big challenge of our members, is we find that 70% of them at some point do work for a client and never get paid. So we need to find a way to be bringing protections to those workers as contractors and not telling them to wait until they get classified as an employee.
Yeah, I know, and I should say also, I think you guys are doing really tremendous work with the Freelancers bill that we were just talking about earlier, this bill that's before the New York City Council, which is basically increasing penalties to make it harder to rip off freelancers, which is something that, as a freelance writer, I've unfortunately experienced and other people have experienced. So I didn't mean to, I think you guys are doing some very valuable work. But I think also, I mean, we can promote good standards for true freelancers. But I think this question about kind of how do we improve things for people who are classified as freelancers, I would actually argue the first step really is, if you're being misclassified, you need to be properly classified. And so you file a complaint with the Labor Department. Or, as people are increasingly doing, and maybe we can kind of talk about that as well, is people are organizing in the so-called gig economy. Freelancers are organizing. So I think that's just another valuable route to take as well.
Caitlin, Cole had mentioned that the Freelancers Union's agreement with Uber. Do you want to give some background on that, or sort of what led to that and what it actually means?
Oh, sure. So, a big thing that Freelancers Union does is we have been providing benefits from health insurance to dental, life, disability, a full suite of different types of benefits for freelancers for the past 15 years in different types of ways. And right now, the way that is happening is through, we have our own platform by which we sort of connect workers to different types of benefits. But we're really eagerly thinking about and engaging in these different conversations around portable benefits, organizing around getting workers benefits, and thinking about platforms. Our impetus for working with Uber and our role in working with Uber is to advise them on setting up their own benefit system for workers. And it's something we're really excited about, because for us it means the opportunity to take a lot of the work we've done and the expertise that we've built around delivering benefits and bring it to a much larger scale than what we've been able to achieve in the past. And so that's really our aim, and we'll see where that takes us. But that's where we are right now, is sort of really thinking about this political moment as one that has a lot of possibilities. That's not clear how things will shake out, but we're really eager to try to push that field forward and see how we can support these different types of benefits experiments that are happening.
So this discussion of portable benefits and Cole, your mention of organizing, gets me thinking more generally about various different solutions that people are putting out there to the difficulty of being a worker in the gig economy. So, obviously, one of the things that's interesting is that we do work in an economic system where benefits are very tied to work, and that is something that dates back to the 1950s and to the fact in something that was called the Treaty of Detroit, when the big three car makers signed an agreement with the United Auto Workers about pensions and healthcare, and then lots of different industries built their systems off of that. I guess I'd be curious, as we're now trying to rethink what it means to have a system that works for workers who no longer work the way, people who worked in, building cars did in the 1950s. What are the solutions that you think are most promising for workers in this new economy?
I mean, I think for just historical perspective, when we look at this question of how to improve work for a specific group of workers, I mean, I think historically it's the workers who know best, and it's through workers organizing that they can test out, what is it that they want on the job, what is it that matters to them, and then they ask the boss and get organized and make changes. So I think, first and foremost, I think we should look to the work that Uber drivers are doing, that other freelancers are doing to organize themselves. And so, there's a great group that exists in New York City, the New York City Taxi Workers Alliance, which has been organizing cab drivers in the city. They're independent contractors, but there are limitations to that. As we mentioned, you're not protected by the National Labor Relations Act, but they've organized in spite of that, and they've been able to get some tremendous victories. So I think, that's a great example. There's also kind of more recently this question of, maybe we can talk about this, is extending collective bargaining rights to independent contractors. So this is, bearing with me for a second because it gets a little wonky, but basically independent contractors are not covered by the National Labor Relations Act on the federal level. That doesn't mean that states or cities necessarily would be unable to protect and extend those rights on their respective levels. That's what happened with agricultural workers, farm workers. They're not protected by the NLRA, but through organizing, eventually they were able to get a state-level bill passed. Yeah, the National Labor Relations Act is the kind of cornerstone of labor law, protecting workers' rights to organize, and it means that if it covers the private sector, most private sector workers. It means that if you get a majority of workers at your place of work and say you want a union and go through the processes, the company is legally mandated to bargain with you. And it's a kind of federally recognized relationship, and that's the kind of right that the NLRA has. So when they originally wrote the law, because of their desire to compromise and get it passed in the 30s, they excluded agricultural workers, they excluded domestic workers, they also excluded public sector workers. And we've seen historically all those groups of workers, through organizing and putting pressure on the state in various states and cities, been able to get bargaining rights extended to them. We saw it with, like I was saying, in California. You guys are probably familiar with Cesar Chavez, United Farm Workers. Through those battles in the 60s, they were able to get a bill passed that extended union rights to farm workers in California in 1975. We saw the same thing happen with public sector workers around the same time period, 60s and 70s. We're seeing recent kind of changes with domestic workers. And then more recently, this is actually the first time this has been attempted, is the city of Seattle extended collective bargaining rights to not all independent contractors, but people who are driving for, I think it's I don't want to mischaracterize it, but I think it's covering people who work for transportation service providers. But it's basically, it's taxi drivers, and it's also Uber and Lyft drivers. And this is a really interesting experiment. The big question is, the city has put this plan into place, but the question is Uber going to follow it? Because it's not a federally recognized union. It would only be recognized on the city level. We all know Uber's, the way Uber views the law on the city level, if not the federal level. So I think there's some doubts whether or not Uber would even bargain with them. There's also this question of, does that violate antitrust law? Because independent contractors are not allowed to form unions traditionally. One of the arguments has been used is that they're basically they're fixing prices, and that's a violation of antitrust law. So these things need to get sorted out. Regardless of all that, I think it's a really interesting proposal, and I'd be kind of curious to see what happens in Seattle.
Yeah.
To go back to the original question,
Yeah.
what do you think are the most promising developments or proposals for gig economy workers?
Well, I don't think I'm going to top Cole's comprehensive review, because I think it was pretty great. And I agree with what you're saying. I think that there are kind of two big points. One is like, why do we think employment's so great and have all these benefits and protections? It's because unions came together and had a long, hard fight and organized to win them, right? And they did that based on how the workforce looked and was working at that time. The workforce is looking and working very differently right now. So how are new unions and labor organizers and advocates going to come together and advocate for this workforce and what it needs today, which might look a little bit different, and the unions might look a little bit different. I think when it comes to thinking about benefits, one of the big things that I would just add is that, actually what you said at the beginning, which is like not enough is known about this workforce and their composition. We have our study, other people have their studies, the government has their study, and I think that there's not enough known about how individuals in this new economy are working and what their needs are. And there needs to be new types of institutions that are working closely with these groups that understand those needs, that can advocate for and represent them and aggregate them, either when bargaining with employers or in other types of marketplaces. The way we try to do that is in the health insurance and benefits marketplace as consumers. And I think that type of understanding, before we get to classification questions and these types of policy questions, will really come out of that organizing work and out of just developing a more, which we're starting to do, more robust conversation about this workforce among policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the classification question can be tied up in the organizing. So, for instance, right now, the various ports in Los Angeles, I think there's 3 of them, where you have the Teamsters that are trying to organize truck drivers who are basically delivering cargo from the ports to warehouses. And they're called independent contractors, but the Teamsters are trying to organize them. So it's kind of interesting, because it's this misclassification question, but it's also they're trying to lift standards and hopefully empower these workers and reach some sort of agreement. So I think the misclassification question, these aren't just like, I don't think there's a wall between them. They're intimately connected, because it's about organizing ultimately should be about empowering workers and giving them the chance to have a say. And misclassification, if they're being misclassified, that should be addressed.
So there are a lot of young people in this audience right now, many of whom may be in their first jobs or looking for their first jobs. And I guess I'd be curious to hear you guys say, what does the gig economy mean for them? Do you have any advice on what it means to sort of go out into the workforce, given the way the workforce is changing?
Am I allowed to address the audience? How many of you guys are doing some type of freelance work? Not as many as I thought. How many have a full-time job? So we already see, I don't know, I'd love to hear your guys' questions. But I mean, I think my biggest advice is if you are entering the workforce and thinking about pursuing a career as a freelancer, is don't be isolated, and make sure you have a really strong network. We see that the most successful freelancers have a great network, not just for finding gigs, but also for support, for, there's a lot on the shoulders of this workforce in terms of what they have to understand in order to put together basically a work life, you're running your own business. You have to understand how to find clients, how to negotiate with clients, how to have a contract that doesn't screw you over, how to manage that relationship, how to do your taxes, how to do all of these things. It's a lot to put on one person's shoulders who also has to be a great writer or a great whatever your main skill is, right? So have a network, have people that you can rely on to talk to about these different types of questions, and make sure you get really educated about what is required of you and how much you need to earn and what your expenses can look like as a result, and save for retirement.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is make sure if you're called a freelancer, make sure you're actually a freelancer. So if you're being misclassified, file a complaint, seriously, with the Labor Department. Like, it's really straightforward. I mean, and that question comes down to like how much control really the employer or potential employer has over what you're doing. So the first thing is make sure you're properly classified. I mean, the second thing is I think it really just depends on kind of what line of work you're in. It's hard to give just blanket advice. I think it depends on kind of what industry you're in. So I mean, as someone who's a freelance writer, it's kind of sucks. It's really hard. So I think there's no easy answer to that. But stay on top of companies that make sure they're paying you. I mean, this is something that you guys have actually been advocating for in this bill that's before the city council. So make sure that you're following up with whoever is contracting with you to make sure they're actually paying you, and make sure you establish something beforehand. If you're writing something, I'll just speaking about this because this is something that I deal with as a writer. Like, make sure you set the terms of the work beforehand. So don't just, if someone wants you to write for them, make sure you have a really clear written agreement. An email is fine, just outlining like what it is you're doing and how much they're going to pay you, and then follow up on that.
Great. So maybe let's give time for audience questions. And I'm actually going to ask, when you ask your question, maybe say your name and if you have an affiliation, say what that affiliation is. So was there?
Hi everyone, my name is Juan, and my question is, how exactly do you know if you were misclassified?
Yeah, no, so there's it gets really kind of like wonky, but there's different kind of different definitions of that. But there's the federal kind of Labor Department definition, and there's basically like a test that if you fit kind of these different categories, then you kind of qualify as an employee regardless of what the contractor is saying. And so there's actually yeah, I mean, go to the federal DOL, the Labor Department website, and it kind of outlines the conditions, because there's different tests as well. But go to the Labor Department website; it has kind of basic categories, and the New York State Department also has a similar one. But by and large, it really comes down to like how much control the employer has over you. Are they saying like come into you're working every like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 9 to 5, for instance? Are they saying come in and you have to do this while on the job, and if you do that, that's not part of the relationship. So it ultimately, like, rather than going down like just the whole 12 or however many different parts there are of the test, it really comes down to this question of control. So and you can sort of feel it as well. Like, do you feel like you have a boss, right? I mean, that's part of it as well. It like comes down to what you feel like, and that's often a kind of a good indicator. Do you have a choice to come into work or not?
But it is a
very complicated legal question,
Yeah.
and that is why.
Right.
I mean, if you're wondering why these lawsuits with Uber have been going on for so long, it's because there are some cases that are really clear-cut. Someone is an independent contractor, and there are some cases that are really clear-cut. This person should be an employee, and there's a lot in the middle, and that's where you get into sort of the arguments back and forth over, really how much control does the employer have over your work life. Other questions? Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Kara Brandysky. Just related to this question about misclassification, it seems like there are a lot of jobs where it might be in the middle. Maybe Uber is one of them where you're not working 9 to 5, but you are working full time. Do you see any potential that lawmakers might decide that we need a third category, not independent contractor, but not quite an employee? And do you think that's something that maybe workers should be advocating for, if you have an opinion on that?
You had a smart answer to that.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier. Yeah.
Well, do you want to start, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that, so there's this paper that Seth Harris and Alan Kruger put out, and I think that the category they propose is the independent worker category. And this is basically like what you're describing, this like sort of in-between kind of status, and where they outline kind of what statutes would apply to this new category. So I think it's a really interesting kind of conversation. I got a chance to ask Tom Perez, the labor secretary, about this, and he seemed to think it's an interesting proposal. So it's certainly something that people are talking about. My gut kind of feeling, or not my gut feeling, my feeling on it is I'm a little suspicious, and I think it lends itself, I think, to abuse and exploitation. We're already having this question of kind of employers saying, you do the work of an employee, but we're going to call you a freelancer. If you're adding another category, why wouldn't they just gives them another option to say, wait, you're not a freelancer, but actually you might fit this in between category, and therefore you're not eligible for unemployment insurance. We don't have to worry about that, or however you would define it. So I think it raises those questions that are kind of concerning, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I think one question, just to add in, is in principle, will a third classification end up being used primarily as a way to take people who should be independent contractors and give them some of the benefits of an employee, or is it primarily a way to take people who should be employees and give them fewer benefits? And part of that depends on literally what kinds of benefits you assign to this third category, which is part of why it's a little bit hard to talk about in the abstract. There is this one specific proposal that people have put out there. There are lots of other potential ways you could design it, but a lot ends up being about how it actually gets designed.
My name is DeWitt. The question I have is, I've been reading recently how Uber's investing a lot of money in self-driving cars, and there's been a lot of protests and movement among Uber drivers to demand, like you mentioned, better classification of their work. Won't this just spur Uber to invest more in self-driving cars and lead them to lay off more of the workers and have more unemployment? Well, I mean, what I'm saying is that the more workers fight back, the more Uber is going to say, okay, well, we don't need you anymore. We're just going to have these cars. They'll do all your work for you, and bye-bye. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's, I'm sure Uber probably thinks that way. I don't want to speak for them, but that's kind of that's like a classic kind of employer, argument. We heard the same thing about the $15 minimum wage, about kind of McDonald's. McDonald's didn't say it, but people who are defending kind of the fast food industry and supporting the fast food industry in opposition to $15 minimum wages have kind of made this argument as well, saying, yeah, you can give these workers a $15 minimum wage, but it means that the companies are going to start using, self-serving, order machines, and, eventually they'll all have robots. So, I mean, it's something that, it's kind of this like, ghost that hangs over any kind of labor struggle, where if you're pushing for better standards, doesn't that just give the employer more incentive to either outsource or automate? So I think it's always a question. There's no way to know for certain, but I would say on the whole, it's probably better that Uber drivers are compensated more for their work, and whatever the company decides about self-driving cars. That's, we'll see how that plays out.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I thought it was really interesting how you brought up kind of the question of whether these benefits need to be tied to employment in the first place. So I guess like in some European countries, the benefits are more state-sponsored. Do you think we'll see in the future a difference in this kind of economy surviving in, say, America and some of these European countries where benefits are kind of more state-sponsored?
Thoughts? Or?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I think it's, like you were mentioning before, the Treaty of Detroit. I mean, it comes out of like this tradition of just, American capitalism, and they've been able to successfully kind of fight off and dissuade, large state interventions of that sort. So, some people, it's hard to say. I mean, I think like we're seeing kind of a renewed like consciousness about kind of younger people seeing state intervention in the economy as actually a positive progressive force. And like the Bernie Sanders campaign kind of speaks to that, underlines that. So I think we're seeing like kind of the shifting kind of consciousness about what you expect the state to provide. So maybe that could be kind of one indicator.
Maybe I'll just add, I mean, the other option is that the state isn't actually providing it, it's just requiring it. So, for example, the ultimate example that people often describe as the quintessential portable benefit is the Affordable Care Act, where obviously it's not the government providing health insurance, but lots of people are getting it through their employers, but if they leave their employer, they still have access to health insurance. So there are lots of different ways to think about how you might model being able to have the benefit even if it's not, even if you don't stay with that specific employer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think there's sort of this question of how do we do collective bargaining with these platforms, and are we just replicating this system by which we're expecting a new type of employer to contribute to benefits? Because underlying the whole portable benefits discussion is, the next question is who's going to pay for this? Is this something that is a worker contribution-led program? Is this something that's coming out of government? Is this something that's coming out of these employers, or some combination thereof? I think that what's becoming increasingly clear is that having all these benefits tied to the employer doesn't work for this growing part of this workforce, and that we need to be thinking about ways that there can be, as the number is, more portability in the benefits. But I don't think it's clear. I think that the best role of government can be sort of looking and testing and figuring out where there's opportunities to be testing out new forms of benefits, right? So we're seeing a lot of these discussions about different types of pilots, and we'll be learning from those and thinking about how to implement them on a national scale. Because I think that when you look at the Affordable Care Act, one of the things it was really successful in doing is bringing benefits to a group of workers that really needed access to subsidies. So the folks who were under a certain percentage of poverty were now all of a sudden getting access to subsidized benefits, which was this great thing. One of the things that's become hard for a lot of our members is now they're mandated to purchase health insurance, which has increased the percentage of people who are covered, but they don't have that access to subsidies, and it's not exactly cheap for them to buy it in this individual market right now. So what we really see is this important role of advocates and groups who are helping basically organize the market and try to find ways to group workers to get them affordability and value in some of the benefits that they're now, being required to consume, so that they are actually experiencing the value from these things. And they're helping to prioritize, I actually really want these 3 other supports. That's most important to me in my industry or my group of workers versus, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of a model.
Hello, good evening. My name is Monica Grant. I'm an organizing consultant. I freelance. I love it. I'm not going back to work. In that capacity, I work for labor unions. I hate bosses. I like being my own boss. But I'm organizing freelancers and particularly campaign workers. And so I've tried to reach out to a freelance union. I would like to know what kind of support do you offer to organizing freelancers?
What kind of support? What is the work? Tell me what work you're doing.
Okay, yeah. So I started canvassing, 5-6 years ago. I'm college educated. I moved up in the ranks in the organizing world, but there's a lot of people that didn't because of lack of education. Maybe they had a criminal record, but they're really great at what they do. And so, they're able to work different campaigns, but it's not consistent work. A lot of the work is under the table. There's no benefits. You get hurt on the job, get bit by a dog, get, arrested by the police, stop and frisk, things like that. There's no employer protection. And so, after years, I'm seeing the same people, and it's like, whoa, there's a big issue here. Where we say we're looking out for, the poor people, we're not. And so, we've been coming together for the past few months, and there's a lot of the same labor issues going on, but there's consistent campaign work going on as well. So there's a need for the workers. This is a profession. It's an industry that needs more training, more education, and just more support and more public understanding of what this work requires. Because you can't just jump in and be a canvasser. You can't just jump in and be an organizer. This is a skill that you have to develop. And so my goal is to raise the professionalism of the industry, but also protect these people.
That's super interesting. So many workers that are doing this type of activism and social change work are freelancers too, so I think that's a super interesting project. We should talk after. But one of the things we do is try to provide an umbrella for these types of activities so that we're connecting different projects. We have our own agenda that we work with, but we also have a network of 300,000 other freelancers that we work to connect both online and in person in different local groups. We have these meetups called Sparks that happen in 23 different cities, which are where freelancers get together and share concerns and do educational workshops and talk about these types of issues. So we have a whole network for people that are doing interesting projects to plug into.
Hi, my name is Greg. I wanted to ask about the tension within the labor movement, about how to approach the gig economy. I know a lot of traditional labor unions see the gig economy as an existential threat to their industries and are fighting as hard as they can to kind of sink companies like Airbnb and Uber so they don't expand and take over existing industries and existing union membership. But then on the other hand, there are other unions who are thinking, they like the Freelancers Union that see an emerging workforce and want to raise standards for them. So how do you resolve that tension between traditional labor and new labor, if you will?
Good question.
One thing I would point to, it's a huge challenge, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it's an ongoing dialogue that's happening that I see really moving forward in a lot of places, which I find really exciting. One thing that we've been really amazed by is that, as Cole mentioned, we have this piece of legislation in New York City Council right now that's around non-payment for freelancers. So it would give them protections where they now have none when they get stiffed by clients. We've been able to actually build a really strong coalition around that legislation, including unions like AFT, UFT, 32BJ, kind of traditional community organizers like Make the Road, and then also other kind of more non-traditional labor advocates in the freelance world. And we're seeing that as really interesting because we're now connecting some of the more traditional wage theft work that's been so strong in the city with this bill, and it's been kind of amazing to see those groups come together in recognition that this is a problem that we can solve better by working together. I just point to that as one optimistic example, but I think it's a very challenging conversation.
Yeah, I would say also I don't think that all the unions see the emergence of the gig economy as an existential threat. I think actually there are examples of unions right now that are trying to organize people in the gig economy. So I mentioned the thing in Seattle that's actually being led by the Teamsters local out there in Washington State. It sort of saw this Uber thing emerge and decided, let's not sit on the sidelines, let's get involved and actually, try to help support them organizing. And I think also, for instance, in New York City here, the Amalgamated Transit Union, ATU, is actually involved in kind of organizing Uber drivers as well. But you're right, it does highlight this tension of do we just try to keep Uber out because it's so, terrible for standards, as it depresses wages, it hurts the industries that we're in, or do we kind of confront the challenge by organizing them? And I mean, I think if history isn't any example, I think the latter is probably the more preferable option.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. Did I kill off the room by saying that?
What would happen? Do you think some of these companies would be able to survive financially if they would have to provide like all these benefits that regular companies have to provide? Do you think would they be able to survive, attract investors and so forth? Because I think a lot of these companies aren't even profitable; they're just going based on investors. So I think that if this was to hit, a lot of them wouldn't be able to survive. They bring in investors. So is that even possible to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting question. It gets at this tension of are these apps are they succeeding because they have really good technology? They've come up with this way of connecting people that no one has done before, and that's the basis for their success, or is the basis for their success basically rampant illegal misclassification and flouting of the law? And if that's what they're doing, do we want to live in a society where companies are just breaking the law, on a regular basis? Their whole business model depends on law breaking. I don't think that's good. And so maybe I think the answer is if a company can't afford to follow the law, then they probably shouldn't be around in the first place.
Okay. And on that note.
It's a good principle to end on.
Let's give Shayna, Caitlin, and Cole a round of applause for a fantastic discussion. My name is Oscar Valdez. I'm the economics intern here at the Century Foundation. Thanks again to everyone for coming out tonight. This concludes our discussion for the evening. But before you start lining up for your first round of wine and cheese, let me remind you that TCF will host one more event like the one we had tonight. It will be on July 13, same time, same place, and we'll feature a conversation on the high costs of college. The event is titled Overeducated, Underemployed, Is College Worth the Costs? To learn more about this event and to RSVP, visit our website at tcf.org. We would love to have everyone back for that discussion.